Hey there, it's Jennifer from the blog, The Everyday Farmhouse. Today we're going to start a sourdough starter using a dried, dehydrated starter. And the reason for doing this is it's kind of a foolproof way to get your starter going. I know I've made my own starters in the past, and there was kind of some guesswork with it and whether or not it was good. Had some turn out that maybe didn't have the best flavor. And so this time I wanted to go this route and it's kind of like getting a little bit of starter from a friend. I ordered mine from Tara at She's Rooted Home. It comes in a nice little package. She dehydrates this herself. And so I know that it's a good starter, and all I'm doing is rehydrating it, kind of reactivating it, getting it going again so that I can use it in my own baking. So I'm going to show you how to go from a dehydrated starter to getting your own nice bubbly starter going. So first of all, the things that you'll need, not much. It's a very simple process. It takes a few days, and everything with sourdough kind of takes a little longer. The rise on your bread takes a little longer. Kind of have to plan ahead with sourdough. You have to decide, okay, I'm gonna want bread, the next day typically, because you want it to have that time to ferment and to rise. It's not as quick and easy as using an activated yeast that you would buy from the store, but the health benefits are far greater. So if you have trouble digesting grains, this might be a good place to start. If you're wanting to get some grains back in your diet, you might be able to tolerate sourdough bread. So things that you'll need to start a small glass jar with a lid. I didn't bring a lid over. You can also use something like a beeswax wrap or a coffee filter. It doesn't need to be airtight, but just something that will keep, fruit flies or whatever else out of it. Eventually you'll move it to a bigger quart-sized jar. You'll need a measuring cup, something to stir with. I like to scrape the sides down so that I can see if it's rising well, and some measuring spoons. I use Prairie Gold white whole wheat flour, and I use filtered water. Now, as far as the flour goes, you can use whatever type of flour you like. There's lots of studies that you can read about which type gets the starter going quickest, what your results. You can study that on your own. I read about it and decided I'm gonna go with the flour that I use the most. And so I use this. It's a very finely ground, light wheat flour, but I like the way it bakes. And so that's what I used for my starter. And then as far as the water goes, if you live in the city and you have chlorinated water, that's something you would definitely want to filter out. That can affect your starter. Otherwise, filtered water is not absolutely necessary, but I like to use it because we have this Berkey filter that we like, and I like to know that I'm putting good, clean water into my starter and there's not going to be anything interfering with it. So that's what you need to get started. I'm going to show you day by day, every single feeding, and the progress that we make. So as you can see, for this first part, you're going to take your pint jar. You're going to take your dehydrated organic sourdough starter, open that up, and you're going to measure out 2 tablespoons of starter. I had already done one starter from this package, and so I didn't have quite 2 tablespoons, but it worked out just fine. So measure that into your pint jar, and then you're going to mix this with a 1/4 cup filtered water. You're going to stir this really well and let it sit for about 1 or 2 hours, and you can come back and stir it occasionally if you'd like. Okay, now we're on to our first feeding. You're going to take a heaping tablespoon of flour and just stir that in with the dried starter that you mixed with water. Stir this up and let it sit for 8 to 12 hours. Go ahead and cover the jar with a loose fitting lid or a piece of beeswax wrap, something like that. Okay, so now we're on to our second feeding. You can look and see there's some liquid on the top. That's called hooch. It's just like an alcohol byproduct of the fermentation process. You can drain that off, or you can just stir it in. I usually just let it stay there. Now we mix in a 1/4 cup water, filtered water, and a 1/4 cup flour. And so you just mix those together, and now you're going to let this sit again for 8 to 12 hours. If you're doing this in the morning, you can just come back at nighttime and give it another feeding, or you can wait till the next day. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so we're on to our next feeding, and now I'll show you the inside here. It's kind of exciting. We can already see some bubbles after that 8 hours. So that's a good sign of life and that things are progressing the way they should. So now we're just going to add a 1/4 cup of flour and a 1/4 cup filtered water. We're going to stir that up and then let it sit again for 8 to 12 hours. So if you're doing this first thing in the morning, then you can let it sit until evening and feed it then, or you can wait till the next day, whatever you prefer. All right, so now we're at a place where our starter's bubbling and it's growing. And so at this point, it's going to be too big for the jar after we feed it this time. So you really need to feed it almost equal parts starter and flour and water. So we're going to go ahead and move this from a pint-sized jar. We started off in a pint jar just to make it easier to stir. Now we're going to move it into its bigger quart-sized jar. And this time we're going to feed it a little bit more and stir that up, and then again just let it sit for 8 to 12 hours. This time I'm feeding it 1/2 cup flour and 1/2 cup water. After this feeding, you can see we've got some of that hooch on top again. This can mean that it's hungry, that maybe I'm not feeding it quite enough. So we're going to give it a little bit more this time. I could probably have done up to 1 cup. This time I did about 3/4 cup and then 3/4 cup of water to feed it this time. I like to put the rubber band around it just so I can see how much it's rising, so I can see if it's going above the level, if it's doubling yet, because that's really what we're looking for the activity, is for it to double in size. That's how we know it's really ready to use. Okay, so this should be our last feeding before we can use our starter. So I have 2 starters here to show you. This is an older starter that I keep. I actually fed this one this morning, and you can see that it's nice and bubbly. It's risen above my rubber band line, and it looks good, like it's ready to bake with. This is the one that we've been working on for the last, 5 days. And it hasn't been fed. I didn't feed it this morning. I wanted to show you all how to do that. And I also wanted to talk about how big this starter has gotten and what we need to do with it. So if you're a smaller family, you don't have a lot of baking that you're gonna do, you don't need a starter this big. This would be more than you would want to try to maintain. So what I'm gonna do, I like to keep a big starter, but since I already have some, I'm gonna split this in 2. So if you were in this situation, you didn't want this much, you could do the same thing. You could split it up. I'm gonna give some to my mom because she wants to get started in sourdough. So I'm gonna give her some. You could dump it. You could feed it to your chickens if you have chickens. You could put it in your compost. You can throw it out, whatever. But you don't, the problem with keeping this much is that you're gonna have to feed it pretty much equal amount to keep it healthy. And obviously this is not gonna hold double the amount anymore. This jar is not. So, and also I don't know if I talked about the lid. It does not need to be an airtight lid. You want it to actually be able to get air. So I just use regular lids, sometimes plastic ones that can, and I just don't put it on super tight. You could also use something like a beeswax wrap over the top. That way it can still breathe. And I think that's a good choice too. So you can see with this starter, it's bubbling a little bit, but it's not quite ready to use. So we're gonna split this up. We're gonna feed it one more time, and then we're gonna come back in about 4 hours so you can see what it looks like when it's very active and when it's ready to be used. So I'm just gonna scoop some into here for my mom. And then I'm gonna put the rest in this big jar. It smells sour. It's not an offensive smell by any stretch, just smells a bit sour, and it looks nice and healthy. What you might notice when you go to feed, I think I've mentioned this before, is that there might be a little bit of water on top. That just means it's hungry. It looks like water. It's actually called hooch, but it's an alcohol byproduct of the fermentation process. You can stir that in, you can drain it off. It's really just your preference. So this one for my mom, I'm gonna feed it a half a cup of flour and a half a cup of filtered water. And you can see when I don't know if you can see, but I can see when I'm stirring it, it's starting to bubble up. It gets the little bubbly holes in it. That is a very good indication that it's alive and well. This one I'm gonna feed more. I'm gonna give it about 1.5 cups of flour. I could have grabbed a bigger measuring cup. And the same with water. This does not have to be all that precise. And give that a stir. And then we're gonna come back in about 4 hours and see how this looks. See if we're ready to start baking with it. Okay, so last time I split my starter up and split it into a small one and a larger one. So I just want to show you the progress on that. I intended to leave it just 4 hours to see how active it would be. And our house is pretty cold right now. It didn't do a whole lot. So I fed it a little bit more last night before bed and left it overnight. And today there's a lot more activity. You can see the bubbles on the side. I want to show you the difference between what this looks like and then my mature starter. And so the activity I fed it last night as well, the activity with that was a lot more. So I would say you could bake with these. I'll show you the inside. I don't know that you would have the very best results. The inside looks really nice and bubbly. The consistency is really good. I like it to be like this. It's, you know, some people describe it different ways. Some people say pancake batter. This is a pretty thick pancake batter. Almost looks like, I don't know, marshmallow fluff or something, something like that. But this one looks pretty good. I think that you could bake with it. I don't know that I would try a artesian loaf with it just yet. I might feed it one more time before I did something like that. And here's the smaller one. It too looks pretty good and bubbly. So it's just kind of something you need to get to know. You need to watch your starter and see how it behaves. Now, you know, when it's like this mature one, I would have no hesitation at all baking with that. It's really nice and bubbly. It rose a lot overnight. Typically they say between 4 to 8 hours of feeding is its peak time. That's when it's at its most active and probably the best time to use it. Can you use it when it's past that peak? I sure have. I've had good results. You know, it's just one of those things you kind of have to play around with. If you're like me, I want to jump into something and know that I'm going to succeed and do really well the first try. And unfortunately with sourdough, it's just not always that way. You're likely going to have some fails. So anyway, I hope this helps you to have the courage to get started, to see that it's not a difficult process. You know, we rehydrated this over the course of 4 or 5 days, feeding it once on some days, and then on other days we fed it twice, and we wound up, from dried starter, we wound up with just a large quantity of really nice, healthy sourdough starter. So I hope you get going with this. Okay, so that's it. You did it. You went from a dehydrated starter, and now I know if you're like me, you've got more than enough starter going, enough to share maybe with your family or friends and get them going on sourdough. And I'm just so glad that you're coming along for this Handmade Home Challenge, and I hope that you're gonna follow along the rest of the month. I'll be posting some good sourdough recipes to make, some good beginner-friendly recipes that I've tried to get us started using our new starter. So thanks again for stopping by today, and I hope you have a great week.